The crowd at Clara's diner fell silent as the door swung open, allowing Faith O'Malley to enter with her head held high despite the whispers that followed her like shadows. At 28, she was Silver Creek's most notorious spinster, a woman who'd chosen independence over matrimony in a town where most girls were wed before their 18th birthday. It was 1878, and Faith had just purchased the abandoned millinery shop on Main Street, much to the disapproval of nearly everyone in the small Colorado settlement. "Well, if it isn't Faith still fancy-free," drawled Mabel Henderson, whose 3 daughters were all married with children before they turned 20. "Don't you worry about dying alone, dear. The clock's ticking something fierce." Faith smoothed her sage green skirt and approached the counter, ignoring the sting of Mabel's words. "Coffee, please, Clara." "Black." Clara Wilkins, the sturdy proprietress, slid a steaming cup toward Faith. "Don't you mind, Mabel? Some folks don't understand that a woman might want something other than a husband and a house full of young-uns." "Thank you, Clara," Faith murmured, taking a grateful sip. "Though I don't recall saying I never wanted those things, just that I wanted other things first." Faith had arrived in Silver Creek 5 years ago, fleeing the suffocating expectations of her family in Boston. Her father, a prominent banker, had arranged 3 separate engagements for her, each to men who viewed her as little more than decorative property. Each time, Faith had refused, until finally, with a small inheritance from her grandmother, she'd fled west to make her own way. The bell above the diner's door jangled, and every female head in the place turned. Faith kept her eyes on her coffee until a deep voice ordered breakfast right beside her. Eggs, bacon, and whatever passes for decent coffee in this establishment. Faith glanced sideways at the newcomer. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind, he cut an imposing figure. His dark hair was in need of a trim, curling slightly at the nape of his neck, and his clothes, while dusty from the trail, were of good quality. The stranger seemed unaware of the feminine attention he commanded, his eyes a striking shade of gray focused on the food Clara set before him. "You're new," Faith observed, immediately regretting the obvious statement. Those gray eyes shifted to her face. "Just rode in. Preston Hayes," he offered with a slight nod. "Cattle buyer. Faith O'Malley. I own the millinery shop down the street, or I will once I finish the renovations." Preston's gaze lingered on her face a moment longer than strictly necessary. "A businesswoman. Impressive." From across the diner, Mabel's voice carried. "Don't waste your time on that one, mister. She's determined to die an old maid." Faith's cheeks burned, but Preston merely raised an eyebrow. "Madam, where I come from, it's considered impolite to comment on affairs that don't concern you." A hush fell over the diner. No one spoke to Mabel Henderson that way, not when her husband owned half the businesses in town. Mabel's face hardened. "Well, I never." "Perhaps you should sometime," Preston replied mildly, returning his attention to his breakfast. Faith bit her lip to hide her smile. "You might have made an enemy there, Mr. Hayes. Wouldn't be the first time." He sipped his coffee. "So, a millinery shop, you're a hat maker?" "I am." "Trained in Boston before coming west." "Boston's a long way from Silver Creek." Faith nodded. "Sometimes distance is necessary to become who you're meant to be." Something flickered in Preston's eyes, recognition, perhaps. "I understand that better than most." For the first time in years, Faith felt the unfamiliar flutter of possibility in her chest, but she quickly tamped it down. A cattle buyer would soon be on his way, and she had a business to establish. The last thing she needed was another distraction from her hard-won independence. Faith drained her coffee cup. "It was nice meeting you, Mr. Hayes. Good luck with your cattle business." Preston nodded. "And you with your hats, Miss O'Malley." As Faith walked toward the door, she felt his eyes following her. It was probably nothing, just another man passing through a small town. Men like that never stayed. And Faith had learned the hard way that pinning hopes on transient connections only led to disappointment. Outside, the October air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. Faith pulled her shawl tighter and headed toward her shop, determined to finish organizing her supplies before sunset. Her living quarters above the shop were still sparse, but they were hers, bought with her own money and her own determination. As she walked, she couldn't help but replay the encounter with the stranger. Preston Hayes. Something about him seemed different from the cowboys and miners who typically passed through Silver Creek. There was an intelligence in his eyes, a quietness to his confidence that spoke of experience beyond cattle drives and saloons. Faith shook her head, clearing away such thoughts. She had spent years building her skills, saving her money, and planning for this shop. Romance, especially with a drifter, had no place in her carefully constructed future. When she reached her shop, Faith was surprised to find the front door slightly ajar. Heart pounding, she pushed it open cautiously. Inside, 13-year-old Tommy Wilson was sweeping the floor with more enthusiasm than skill. "Tommy, you startled me. What are you doing here?" The boy grinned, revealing a missing front tooth. "Ma said I should come help you get set up. Said you could use a strong back, and I could use 50 cents. Faith smiled. Sarah Wilson was one of the few women in town who had never criticized Faith's unmarried state. As a widow raising 3 children alone, Sarah understood better than most the value of female independence. "Your mother's right on both counts. Start by moving those crates to the back room, please." As Tommy worked, Faith unpacked her finest materials, imported ribbons from France, feathers from exotic birds, and silks in every color imaginable. By nightfall, her display table was arranged with half a dozen completed hats, each one a small work of art. Tommy whistled appreciatively. "Those sure are fancy, Miss Faith. Think ladies around here will buy them?" Faith stroked a peacock feather thoughtfully. "Some will. And those who don't will come around once they see how the right hat can transform a plain dress into something special." After paying Tommy and sending him home, Faith climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment. The rooms were simple but clean: a small parlor, a bedroom, and a tiny kitchen. She had splurged on a comfortable armchair placed near the window, where she could read and watch the street below. As she prepared a simple supper of bread and cheese, Faith caught sight of a figure across the street. Preston Hayes stood in conversation with Howard Jenkins, the owner of the largest ranch in the area. Even from a distance, she could see the intensity of their discussion, the way Preston gestured with his hands as he spoke. Faith moved away from the window, annoyed with herself for noticing him again. Men like Preston Hayes didn't factor into her plans. She'd worked too hard to establish herself to be distracted by a handsome face and a moment of kindness in a diner. Yet as she lay in bed that night, Faith found herself wondering if he would still be in Silver Creek tomorrow, and what color his eyes might be in the morning light. The next day dawned bright and cool. Faith was arranging her shop window when the shadow of a tall man fell across the display. "Your work is impressive, Miss O'Malley." Faith turned to find Preston Hayes studying her creation, a deep blue velvet hat adorned with silver ribbon and a single white feather. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes, though I'm surprised a cattle buyer would take notice of millinery." A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "My mother owned a small dressmaking shop in Chicago. I spent my childhood surrounded by fabrics and trimmings." Faith raised an eyebrow. "And yet you chose cattle over couture. Life takes unexpected turns." His eyes held hers for a moment. "I've been speaking with Jenkins about his herd. I'll be in town longer than expected. Would you join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant this evening?" The invitation caught Faith off guard. I have a great deal of work to do here. Even businesswomen need to eat, Preston observed mildly. 7 o'clock, Faith hesitated. Dining with a man would only fuel the town gossip. On the other hand, the prospect of an intelligent conversation with someone who didn't judge her choices was tempting. Very well, Mr. Hayes. 7 o'clock. After he left, Faith tried to focus on inventory, but her mind kept wandering. It had been years since she'd accepted a dinner invitation from a man. Her last suitor had been a banker's son in Boston who'd proposed marriage after 3 chaperoned meetings, offended when Faith suggested they might take time to know each other first. At 6:30, Faith changed into her best dress, a deep burgundy wool with ivory trim. She pinned her honey-brown hair into a simple but elegant knot and added a touch of rose water to her wrists. Not for Preston Hayes, she told herself firmly. It was simply a matter of presenting herself professionally in public. The Grand Hotel was Silver Creek's finest establishment, which wasn't saying much by Eastern standards, but the dining room boasted white tablecloths and a French chef poached from Denver. As Faith entered, she felt the stares of other diners. Whispers followed her to the table where Preston waited. "You look lovely," he said, standing as she approached. "Thank you." Faith settled into her chair, acutely aware of Mabel Henderson and her husband watching from across the room. "I believe we're providing tonight's entertainment for the good people of Silver Creek." Preston glanced around, his expression hardening as he noted the curious stares. Small towns, always hungry for something to talk about, and a spinster dining with a stranger is particularly appetizing fodder. "Is that how you see yourself, as a spinster?" Preston asked as the waiter poured their wine. Faith considered the question. "It's what they call me. I've never felt the label suited me particularly well." "What would you call yourself then? Independent, determined?" She smiled slightly. "Perhaps a little stubborn." "All admirable qualities," Preston said, raising his glass. "To independence." As they dined on roast beef and potatoes, Faith found herself relaxing in Preston's company. He spoke of his travels across the Western Territories, of the changing cattle industry, and of his dreams to establish his own ranch someday. "Why Silver Creek?" Faith asked. "There are larger markets elsewhere." Preston hesitated, swirling the wine in his glass. "I have my reasons for choosing this area. The grazing is good, water is plentiful, and the railroad connection makes shipping easier." Faith sensed there was more to his story, but she didn't press. Everyone had their secrets, their private motivations. Hers had brought her across a continent. Who knew what distances Preston Hayes had traveled both physically and otherwise to reach this small Colorado town? After dinner, Preston walked Faith back to her shop. The night air was crisp, stars brilliant against the black sky. They strolled in comfortable silence until reaching her door. "Thank you for a pleasant evening," Faith said, fishing her key from her reticule. "The pleasure was mine." Preston paused, then added, "I've arranged to stay in Silver Creek for at least a month. Jenkins has a large herd to assess, and there are other ranchers interested in selling." Faith felt an unexpected flutter of pleasure at the news. "Well then, perhaps we'll cross paths again. I'm counting on it." Preston tipped his hat. "Good night, Miss O'Malley." As Faith watched him walk away, she tried to ignore the warmth spreading through her chest. One dinner didn't signify anything. Preston Hayes was simply a polite man making conversation in a strange town. And yet, there had been moments when she'd caught him watching her with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. Faith shook her head at her own foolishness. Even if Preston was interested, and that was a significant if, he would eventually leave Silver Creek. Men like him always did. Better to focus on her shop and the grand opening she'd planned for next week. Still, as she readied for bed, Faith caught herself humming a tune she hadn't sung in years. The following days brought a flurry of activity. Faith finished setting up her shop, placed advertisements in the local newspaper, and sent invitations to the ladies of Silver Creek for her grand opening. Throughout it all, she caught only glimpses of Preston riding out to ranches with Jenkins, conferring with the telegraph operator, dining alone at the hotel restaurant. On Wednesday, Faith was surprised by a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, she found a silver thimble engraved with delicate flowers and a note, "For a woman who creates beauty with her hands. Good luck with your opening. P.H." Faith traced the engraving with her fingertip, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. It was a practical item, yes, but also personal, something chosen with her craft and passion in mind. She was still admiring the thimble when her shop door opened, admitting Sarah Wilson and her 16-year-old daughter, Emma. "Faith, the shop looks wonderful," Sarah exclaimed, embracing her friend. "We came to see if you need any help before your grand opening." "Actually, I could use some assistance arranging the hat stands," Faith admitted, "and perhaps some advice on pricing for the local market." As they worked, Emma eyed Faith curiously. "Is it true you had dinner with that cattle buyer, Mr. Hayes?" "Emma," Sarah scolded, "that's none of our business." Faith smiled wryly. "It's all right, Sarah. Yes, Emma, we had dinner. Mr. Hayes is a business acquaintance." Emma sighed dreamily. "He's so handsome. Half the girls in town are swooning over him. Lori Jenkins says her father might sell him their north pasture for his own ranch." This news surprised Faith. "He's planning to stay in Silver Creek permanently. That's the rumor," Sarah confirmed. "Though you know how talk flies in this town. Remember when everyone was convinced the new schoolteacher was a runaway nun?" The women laughed, but Faith's mind was stuck on the possibility that Preston might remain in Silver Creek. It shouldn't matter to her one way or another, she reminded herself firmly. Her focus was on establishing her business, not on a man she barely knew. Later that afternoon, Faith was arranging her window display when the distinctive click of spurs on the boardwalk announced a visitor. She turned to find Preston filling her doorway, hat in hand. "Your shop looks ready for business," he observed, taking in the neatly arranged displays and cheerful interior. "Thank you. We open Saturday." Faith touched the silver thimble which she'd pinned to her dress. "And thank you for this." "It's lovely." Preston's eyes warmed at the sight of his gift. "It suits you." He stepped further into the shop, examining a midnight blue hat trimmed with silver stars. "This reminds me of the night sky over the plains. Beautiful work." "You have a good eye, Mr. Hayes." "Preston, please." "After sharing dinner, I think we can dispense with formalities." Faith hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, Preston." He smiled at the sound of his name on her lips. "I've come with an invitation. Jenkins is hosting a harvest dance at his ranch this Friday. Would you accompany me?" Faith's pulse quickened. A public dance was different from a quiet dinner. It was a declaration of sorts, especially in a community as small as Silver Creek. "I'm not sure that's wise. People will talk." Preston stepped closer. "People already talk." Would it be so terrible to give them something worth talking about? Faith couldn't help but laugh. "You're not concerned about associating with the town spinster?" "Faith." The way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine. "I've never cared much for other people's opinions of me." "And I suspect neither have you, given your choices." He was right, of course. Faith had defied convention at every turn, refusing arranged marriages, traveling alone across the country, establishing a business as a single woman. Why should she start caring about gossip now? Very well. "I'll go to the dance with you." Preston's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'll collect you at 6. After he left, Faith pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks. What was she doing? Preston Hayes was stirring feelings she'd long ago packed away, feelings that complicated her carefully ordered life. And yet, the prospect of seeing him again filled her with a giddy anticipation she hadn't experienced in years. "Focus on the shop," she muttered to herself. "The shop is what matters." But as she worked, Faith found herself planning what she would wear to the dance and wondering if Preston knew how to waltz. Friday evening arrived with a sky ablaze in orange and gold. Faith stood before her small mirror, assessing her appearance with a critical eye. She wore a gown of forest green silk, her finest dress, brought from Boston and rarely worn in Silver Creek. Her hair was arranged in an elegant twist, adorned with a small spray of artificial pearls. At precisely 6, a knock sounded on her door. Faith took a deep breath, steadying her nerves before opening it. Preston stood on her threshold, the setting sun gilding his profile in bronze light. He wore a black suit with a crisp white shirt, his usual trail dust nowhere in evidence. At the sight of Faith, his eyes widened appreciatively. "You're beautiful," he said simply. Faith felt herself blush. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself." Preston offered his arm. "Shall we give the gossip something to chew on?" The Jenkins Ranch lay 3 miles outside town. Preston had arranged for a buggy, and as they drove through the deepening twilight, Faith found herself stealing glances at his profile. There was something about him that called to her a depth, a steadiness that she found increasingly compelling. "Tell me about Boston," Preston said as they crested a hill. "What made you leave?" Faith considered the question. "Have you ever felt that the life others planned for you was slowly suffocating you?" Preston nodded. "More than you know. I was raised to be ornamental, to play the piano adequately, to speak French passably, and to eventually marry a man of my father's choosing. But I wanted more." Faith gazed at the darkening landscape. "I had an aunt who never married. She traveled the world, wrote books, lived exactly as she pleased. When she died, she left me enough money to escape. And you chose millinery," Faith smiled. "I'd always been good with my hands, with creating beautiful things. I apprenticed with a hat maker in Boston secretly, learning the trade while my father arranged marriages I had no intention of honoring." "You're braver than most men I know," Preston remarked. "Not brave. Desperate, perhaps." Faith turned to study him. "What about you? What brings a Chicago boy to cattle country?" A shadow crossed Preston's face. "A need for open spaces, for air I could breathe without tasting smoke and lies." Before Faith could ask what he meant, they arrived at the Jenkins Ranch. Lanterns illuminated the yard, and the big barn had been cleared for dancing. A 3-piece band played a lively tune while couples whirled across the floor. As Preston helped Faith from the buggy, she felt the weight of stares. Mabel Henderson stood with a cluster of women, their disapproving gazes fixed on Faith. Among the younger girls, including Emma Wilson, the focus was decidedly on Preston. "Ignore them," Preston murmured, guiding Faith toward the barn. Inside, the music and conversation momentarily faltered as they entered, then resumed with increased intensity. Howard Jenkins approached, a barrel-chested man with a booming voice. "Hayes, glad you could make it," he nodded to Faith. "Miss O'Malley, a pleasure. Haven't had the opportunity to welcome you properly to our little community." "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Your ranch is lovely. Been in the family 30 years. Jenkins clapped Preston on the shoulder. "This young man's looking to put down similar roots. Just sold him my north pasture today." Faith glanced at Preston in surprise. "Congratulations. That's quite a commitment to Silver Creek. Something flickered in Preston's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps. It's time I stopped drifting. Jenkins moved away to greet other guests, and Preston led Faith toward the refreshment table. As he handed her a cup of punch, Mabel Henderson intercepted them. "Mr. Hayes, how good of you to bring Miss O'Malley. So few men are willing to escort a woman of her maturity." Mabel's smile was venomous sweet. Why, she was turning down proposals when my Clarissa was still in short dresses. Now Clarissa has 3 beautiful children, and poor Faith has hats. Faith felt the familiar sting of Mabel's words, but before she could respond, Preston spoke. "I found, Mrs. Henderson, that people who marry merely to avoid being alone often end up the loneliest of all." His tone was pleasant, but his eyes were cold. Faith chose to wait for what was right rather than settle for what was convenient. I admire that tremendously. Mabel's face flushed an unbecoming shade of red. "Well, some of us understand the natural order of things. A woman's place is wherever she chooses it to be," Preston finished firmly. "If you'll excuse us, I believe this is our dance." He guided Faith onto the floor just as the band struck up a waltz. His arm circled her waist, his hand warm against the small of her back as he led her into the dance. "You didn't have to defend me," Faith said softly. "I know. You're more than capable of defending yourself." Preston's hand tightened slightly on hers. "But no one should have to face that kind of meanness alone." As they whirled among the other couples, Faith felt something shift inside her, a wall beginning to crumble, a door long closed starting to open. Preston Hayes was dangerous not because he might hurt her, but because he made her want things she'd convinced herself she could live without. Later, as they stood at the edge of the dance floor catching their breath, Jenkins' daughter Lori approached with a young cowhand in tow. "Miss O'Malley, Papa says you're opening a hat shop tomorrow. Will you have anything suitable for a wedding?" Faith blinked in surprise. "A wedding?" "Our congratulations in order, Lori," the girl giggled, linking arms with her blushing companion. "Not yet, but Billy here's been saving for a ring. Might be ready to propose by Christmas if the cattle prices hold. In that case, I'd be delighted to create something special for you. Come by the shop next week and we'll discuss designs." After the young couple moved away, Preston smiled at Faith. "Your first commission, it would seem so." Faith shook her head. "Barely 20, both of them, so young to make such a commitment. Do you regret not marrying young?" Preston asked quietly. Faith considered the question. "I regret the pain my choices caused my family. I regret some of the lonely nights. But no, I don't regret waiting. If I had married at 18, I wouldn't be the woman I am now." She glanced up at him. "What about you?" "No wife waiting somewhere. No." Preston's gaze was steady. "There was someone once. It ended badly." Before Faith could inquire further, Howard Jenkins called for attention. The rancher stood on a makeshift platform, raising his glass. "Friends and neighbors, I want to propose a toast to the newest landowner in Silver Creek County. Preston Hayes has purchased the North Pasture and plans to establish a breeding operation for fine horses. To new beginnings and fresh blood in our community." Cheers erupted around them. Faith studied Preston's face as he acknowledged the toast with a nod. There was determination there, but also something that looked almost like uncertainty. "You didn't mention you were buying land to raise horses," Faith said as the music resumed. "I wanted to be sure the deal was final before discussing it." Preston led her toward the barn doors. "Would you like to get some air?" Outside, the night was cool and clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. They walked a short distance from the barn, the music fading to a pleasant background melody. "I grew up with horses," Preston explained as they strolled. "My father raised them before." He paused. "Before things changed, I've always wanted to return to it." "What changed?" Faith asked gently. Preston was silent for a long moment. My father died when I was 16. There were debts I didn't know about. Men came to collect. My mother lost everything: the house, the business, her health. His voice hardened. I learned later that my father had been cheated, that his business partner had stolen from him for years. By then it was too late. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Preston stopped walking, turning to face Faith. I drifted for years, working cattle, saving money. I tried settling once before in Wyoming. Got engaged to a rancher's daughter. What happened? Preston's laugh was hollow. Her father discovered who I really was. The Hayes name isn't exactly respected in certain Chicago business circles, thanks to my father's partner's machinations. The engagement was broken and I moved on. That's why you came to Silver Creek, a fresh start. Yes, Preston's eyes met hers. I didn't expect to find someone like you here. Faith's heart quickened. Someone like me. Someone who understands what it means to leave everything behind. To remake yourself according to your own design rather than others' expectations. Preston took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. Someone who makes me want to stop running. The intensity in his gaze made Faith tremble. She'd built walls around her heart for so long that the prospect of lowering them was terrifying. Preston, I'm not asking for promises, he said quickly. Just a chance, to see what might grow between us. Before Faith could respond, shouts erupted from the barn. They turned to see people streaming outside, pointing at the horizon where an orange glow lit the night sky. Fire, someone yelled. Town's on fire. Faith's blood ran cold. My shop. Preston was already moving, pulling her toward their buggy. Let's go. The ride back to Silver Creek was a blur of fear and desperate hope. As they crested the final hill, the extent of the disaster became clear. 3 buildings on Main Street were fully engulfed in flames. One of them was Faith's millinery shop. Preston pulled the buggy to a halt at the edge of town. Faith was out before it had fully stopped, running toward the inferno that had been her dream, her independence, her future. Strong arms caught her before she could get too close. "Let me go," she cried, struggling against Preston's grip. "It's too dangerous," he insisted, holding her firmly. "The buildings are lost, Faith. Don't let them take you too." Faith stopped fighting, sagging against him as the terrible truth sank in. Everything she'd worked for was disappearing before her eyes, her inventory, her tools, her home. All of it, consumed by merciless flames. The town's volunteer fire brigade worked desperately to prevent the blaze from spreading to adjacent buildings, but there was no hope for the millinery shop. Faith watched numbly as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks, sending flames shooting higher into the night sky. "Miss O'Malley." Tommy Wilson ran up, his face streaked with soot. "Ma sent me to find you. She says you're to come stay with us. We've got the spare room ready." Faith nodded automatically, her eyes fixed on the burning building. "Thank you, Tommy. Tell your mother I'll be there shortly." When the boy had gone, Preston turned Faith to face him. "You're in shock. Let me take you to the Wilsons." "I need to stay," Faith whispered. "I need to see it through to the end." Preston didn't argue. Instead, he removed his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders, then stood beside her in silent support as they watched her dreams turn to ash. Hours later, when the fire had been reduced to smoldering ruins and most of the town had dispersed, Faith finally allowed Preston to help her into the buggy. She felt hollow, emptied of everything but a dull, throbbing ache. "What will you do now?" Preston asked quietly as they approached the Wilson home. Faith stared at her ash-covered hands. "I don't know. Start over, I suppose. Somewhere else. You could stay." Preston's voice was careful, neutral. "Rebuild here." "With what?" Faith laughed bitterly. "Everything I had was in that shop. My savings, my supplies, my home, it's all gone." Preston stopped the buggy outside the Wilsons' modest house. "Faith, look at me." When she raised her eyes to his, he continued, "You're not alone, not if you don't want to be." Something in his expression, earnest, determined, almost fierce in its intensity, broke through Faith's numbness. She felt tears well up, the first since seeing the fire. "I hardly know you," she whispered. "Then give yourself time to know me better. Don't make any decisions tonight." Faith nodded, too exhausted to argue. Preston helped her from the buggy and walked her to the door, where Sarah Wilson waited with concern etched on her kind face. "You rest," Preston said, squeezing Faith's hand. "I'll come by tomorrow." That night, lying in the Wilsons' spare bed, Faith stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the disaster that had befallen her. All her life, she'd relied on herself, fought for her independence. Now, with one cruel stroke of fate, she was dependent on others' charity once again. The thought of leaving Silver Creek twisted painfully in her chest. Despite the gossip and judgment she'd endured, she'd begun to feel at home here. And then there was Preston. Whatever was growing between them would be cut short if she left. Faith turned onto her side, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry for her lost shop, for her uncertain future, and for the sudden, unexpected longing to let someone else help carry her burdens. Morning brought Sheriff Davis to the Wilsons' door with troubling news. The fire hadn't been an accident. Someone had deliberately set it, starting with the abandoned storefront next to Faith's shop. The sheriff had found a kerosene can and evidence that the back door had been forced. "Got any enemies, Miss O'Malley?" the sheriff asked, chewing on a toothpick. Faith shook her head. "No one who would do something like this." "Well, somebody wanted to send a message. Could be they didn't like the idea of a woman setting up business on her own." Sheriff Davis replaced his hat. "I'll keep investigating, but don't hold your breath for answers." After he left, Faith sat at Sarah's kitchen table, turning a cup of coffee between her hands. "Why would anyone do this?" Sarah sighed. "Some folks in this town don't take kindly to women who don't fit their idea of proper. Remember when I tried to run for the school board after Henry died? My porch got egged 3 nights running." A knock at the door interrupted them. Preston entered at Sarah's invitation, his expression grim. "I heard about the sheriff's findings," he said, taking a seat across from Faith. "This wasn't random," Faith nodded. "Apparently I've offended someone badly enough to warrant arson or frighten them." Preston leaned forward. "Independent women have always scared certain types of men." "What do I do now?" Faith's voice wavered. "I can't exactly rebuild without money." Preston glanced at Sarah, then back to Faith. "I'd like to speak with Faith alone, if you don't mind, Mrs. Wilson." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I'll go check on the children." When they were alone, Preston reached across the table to take Faith's hands. "I have a proposition for you." Faith tensed. "I don't need charity, Preston. This isn't charity, it's an investment." His gray eyes were intent on hers. "I want to finance the rebuilding of your shop." "What? Why would you do that?" "Because I believe in what you're creating. Because this town needs businesses like yours." Preston's grip tightened. "And because I can't bear the thought of you leaving." Faith pulled her hands away, standing to pace the small kitchen. "We barely know each other. This is madness." "Is it?" Preston rose as well. "Faith, from the moment I saw you in that diner, standing tall despite the whispers and stares, I felt a connection to you. We're alike, you and I, both running from pasts that tried to define us, both determined to build something that's truly our own. So this is what? An investment in a potential romance." Preston shook his head. "The investment is business, clean and simple. You'll repay me when you can, with interest if it makes you feel better. What grows between us personally, that's separate. That's for us to discover day by day if you're willing." Faith studied his face, searching for deception, for the hidden agenda she'd been trained to expect from men offering help. She found only sincerity and something deeper that made her heart race. "I need time to think," she said finally. Preston nodded. "Of course. But while you're thinking, I want to show you something. Can you ride?" An hour later, they crested a hill on borrowed horses and Preston reined in. Below them stretched a meadow bordered by aspen trees, a small creek cutting through its center. Beyond rose the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, majestic against the blue sky. "This is my land," Preston said, "the north pasture I bought from Jenkins." Faith took in the beauty of the landscape. "It's wonderful. I'm building there." Preston pointed to a flat area near the creek. "A house first, then stables. Eventually, I hope to have the finest horse breeding operation in Colorado." "Why are you showing me this?" Preston turned in his saddle to face her. "Because I want you to understand that I'm not going anywhere, Faith. I'm putting down roots here. Whatever you decide about my offer, about us, I'll still be here." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep inside Faith. For years, she'd guarded against disappointment, against abandonment. Preston was offering not just financial help, but the promise of constancy, something she'd never quite believed in before. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't need to say anything yet." Preston smiled. "Just know that the offer stands, both offers." They rode back to town in companionable silence. As they approached the main street, Faith could see the charred remains of her shop, a stark reminder of all she'd lost. Yet somehow, the sight didn't devastate her as it had the night before. "I'll think about your proposition," she told Preston as he helped her dismount, "and I'll let you know by tomorrow." Preston nodded, his expression hopeful. "That's all I ask." That evening, Faith sat with Sarah Wilson in the small garden behind her house. The children were asleep, and the two women shared a pot of tea as fireflies blinked in the gathering darkness. "He offered to finance my new shop," Faith confessed. "As a business investment." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "That's quite an offer from a man you've known less than 2 weeks." "I know. It's too much, too soon." "Is it?" Sarah set down her teacup. "Faith, when Henry died, I thought my life was over. 3 children to raise alone, no skills beyond keeping house. But then people stepped forward to help, not out of pity, but because they saw value in me and my family. Sometimes accepting help isn't weakness, it's wisdom." Faith sighed. "It's not just the money, it's him, the way he makes me feel." "And how is that? Like maybe I don't have to do everything alone." Faith's voice dropped to a whisper. "Like maybe I was waiting all this time for the right person, not just avoiding the wrong ones." Sarah smiled. "That sounds like something worth exploring. But what if I'm wrong about him? What if I accept his help and then he changes his mind about staying in Silver Creek?" "Life offers no guarantees, Faith. You know that better than most." Sarah reached across to squeeze her friend's hand. "But ask yourself this. Which would you regret more, taking a chance on Preston and possibly getting hurt, or turning away from what might be the love you've been waiting for?" The question followed Faith into sleep that night, echoing in her dreams. By morning, she had her answer. She found Preston at the hotel restaurant having breakfast alone. When he saw her, he stood, his expression carefully neutral. "May I join you?" Faith asked. Preston nodded, pulling out a chair for her. "Have you eaten?" "I'm not hungry." Faith took a deep breath. "I've made my decision." Preston set down his coffee cup. "I'm listening." "I'll accept your investment offer with proper legal documentation and a repayment schedule." Faith met his gaze steadily. "And I accept your other offer as well, the chance to see what might grow between us." The smile that spread across Preston's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "You won't regret it, Faith. Either decision." "I have conditions," she added quickly. "First, This remains a business arrangement separate from our personal relationship. Second, I maintain complete creative control over the shop. And third, Faith hesitated. Third, we take things slowly between us. I've spent too long building my independence to surrender it lightly. Preston reached across the table to take her hand. I wouldn't want you any other way, Faith. Your independence, your determination, they're part of what draws me to you. Over the following weeks, Faith's life transformed in ways she could never have anticipated. With Preston's investment, she secured a new location for her shop larger than the original, with better light and a more prominent position on Main Street. The living quarters above were spacious and comfortable, with windows that caught the morning sun. As word spread about the arson, many in town rallied around Faith. Sarah Wilson organized a sewing circle to help create new inventory. Emma and her friends collected ribbons and trimmings. Even Lori Jenkins contributed, convincing her father to donate lumber for shelving. Not everyone was supportive. Mabel Henderson and her circle made pointed comments about women who entrap wealthy men and loose morals. But their venom seemed to lose its sting in the face of the growing goodwill Faith encountered elsewhere. Throughout it all, Preston was a steady presence. He helped with the rebuilding, offered suggestions for the shop layout, and spent evenings discussing business strategies with Faith. They dined together regularly, sometimes at the hotel, sometimes in Faith's new rooms when she cooked for him. Slowly, cautiously, their relationship deepened. Faith learned about Preston's childhood in Chicago, his years working cattle drives across the Western Territories, his dreams for his horse breeding operation. In turn, she shared stories of her Boston upbringing, her secret apprenticeship with the milliner, her journey west in search of independence. One evening in late November, they sat before the fireplace in Faith's parlor, sharing a bottle of wine as snow fell softly outside. Preston had just returned from Denver, where he'd gone to purchase breeding stock for his ranch. Construction on the house will begin next week, he told her. Should be habitable by spring. Faith smiled. It's happening quickly. Too quickly. No, she admitted. It feels right. Preston set down his wine glass and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. There's something I need to tell you, about why I really came to Silver Creek. Faith turned to face him. What do you mean? The cattle buying was real, but it wasn't my primary purpose. Preston's expression grew serious. I came looking for someone, a man named James Blackwell. Faith frowned. The name doesn't sound familiar. He was my father's business partner, the one who cheated him, who drove him to an early grave and left my mother destitute. Preston's voice hardened. I tracked him for years. Finally learned he'd settled in Silver Creek under a new name. Who is he? Faith asked, though she'd already begun to suspect. Howard Jenkins. Faith gasped. Jenkins? But he's been here for decades. He's one of the most respected men in the county. Yes, with money stolen from my father and others like him. Preston's jaw tightened. He didn't recognize me. I was just a boy when he last saw me, but I knew him instantly. What are you going to do? Preston ran a hand through his hair. That's the thing. I came here for revenge. I planned to expose him, ruin him as he ruined my family. He looked at Faith, his eyes troubled. But then I met you and everything changed. My anger seemed less important than building something new, something good. Faith took his hand. So you're letting it go? I thought I could. I bought the land, started making plans for a future here. Preston sighed. Then I went to Denver and discovered Jenkins is still at it, using the same schemes on cattle investors there that he used on my father. He hasn't changed, Faith. He's still destroying lives. Have you spoken to Sheriff Davis? Without proof, it would be my word against his. And Jenkins owns half the town, including the sheriff's goodwill. Faith sat quietly for a moment, processing this revelation. The fire, she said suddenly. "Do you think Jenkins could have been behind it? Maybe he recognized you after all, suspected your motives." Preston frowned. "It's possible. Though why target your shop rather than me directly, to send a message, to drive me away because he saw us together?" Faith stood, pacing the small room. "It makes sense, Preston. The timing right after the harvest dance where everyone saw us together, where Jenkins announced your land purchase publicly. If that's true, then he's even more dangerous than I thought." Preston rose as well, taking Faith by the shoulders. "Maybe you should leave Silver Creek until this is settled. Go visit your family in Boston or stay with friends elsewhere." Faith shook her head firmly. "No, I'm done running from men who think they can intimidate me into submission. If Jenkins is behind the fire, he needs to be brought to justice for that crime and for what he did to your family." Preston searched her face. "You're the most remarkable woman I've ever met, Faith O'Malley. And you haven't even seen me in a temper yet," she replied with a small smile. They spent the remainder of the evening developing a plan. Preston would continue his investigation into Jenkins' business dealings, gathering evidence that could be presented to authorities beyond Silver Creek. Faith would discreetly speak with other victims of suspicious fires or business setbacks in town, looking for patterns that might implicate Jenkins. As Preston prepared to leave, snow still falling in thick flakes outside, he paused at the door. "Faith, if anything happens, if you feel threatened in any way, promise you'll come to me immediately." "I promise." She reached up to touch his cheek. "Be careful, Preston. Jenkins has more to lose than either of us." Preston caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I have more to lose now than I ever thought possible," he murmured. "Don't doubt that for a moment." After he'd gone, Faith stood at the window watching his figure disappear into the snowy night. The revelation about Jenkins had shaken her, but it had also crystallized something in her heart. The protective fierceness she'd felt when Preston shared his story, her instinctive determination to stand with him against Jenkins, these weren't the reactions of a woman merely considering a romance. She was falling in love with Preston Hayes. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it filled Faith with a peculiar calm, as if some part of her had known all along that this man would be the one to finally break through the walls she'd built around her heart. As November gave way to December, Faith's new shop, christened Faith's Millinery and Fine Accessories, opened to considerable success. Ladies from Silver Creek and surrounding ranches came to admire her creations, many placing orders for Christmas and the upcoming social season. Even some of Mabel Henderson's circle eventually succumbed to temptation, slipping in when they thought no one would notice. Meanwhile, Faith and Preston continued their dual investigations into Howard Jenkins. What they discovered was disturbing. 3 businesses that had competed with Jenkins-owned enterprises had suffered mysterious fires in the past decade. Several ranchers who'd refused to sell land to Jenkins had experienced unexplained cattle losses or damage to property. Most tellingly, Faith learned from the telegraph operator, after some strategic flirtation and a gift of a fine hat for his wife, that Jenkins regularly corresponded with a banker in Denver under 2 different names his own, and an alias he used for less reputable transactions. Preston's inquiries in Denver yielded similar results. Jenkins had been soliciting investments in a non-existent mining operation, using the same methods he'd employed to defraud Preston's father years earlier. 2 weeks before Christmas, Faith was working late in her shop when she heard the front door open. Looking up, she was surprised to see Lori Jenkins enter, snow dusting her cloak. "Miss O'Malley, I need to speak with you," the girl said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's important." Faith set aside the hat she'd been trimming. "Of course, Lori, what is it?" "It's about my father." Lori glanced nervously at the window. And Mr. Hayes, and the fire that destroyed your shop. Faith felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. Come upstairs. We can talk privately there. Once they were settled in Faith's parlor with cups of tea, Lori twisted her hands in her lap. I overheard my father arguing with Mr. Henderson the night before your shop burned. They were in Father's study, and I was supposed to be asleep, but— Go on, Faith encouraged gently. They were talking about you and Mr. Hayes. Father was angry that Hayes had bought the north pasture, said he was asking too many questions about business matters that didn't concern him. Lori's voice dropped to a whisper. Mr. Henderson suggested they send a message that outsiders weren't welcome to upset the order of things in Silver Creek. Father agreed, said starting with your shop would be a fitting example. Faith's hands tightened around her teacup. Did you tell anyone about this? Lori shook her head. I was afraid. Father has a terrible temper when crossed. But then today, I heard him tell Mr. Henderson they needed to deal with Hayes permanently before he could cause more trouble. Tears welled in the girl's eyes. I couldn't stay silent after that. Mr. Hayes has been kind to me, to everyone. And you've never been anything but good to me, despite how badly some folks in town have treated you. Faith moved to sit beside Lori, putting an arm around the girl's shoulders. You've done the right thing telling me this. But Lori, it could be dangerous for you if your father discovers you've spoken to me. I know. Lori wiped away tears. But I couldn't live with myself if something happened to Mr. Hayes and I'd said nothing. After Lori left, promising to stay with a friend for the night, Faith paced her apartment anxiously. She needed to warn Preston immediately, but he'd ridden out to his property that morning to meet with the construction foreman and wasn't expected back until tomorrow. Faith made a swift decision. Changing into her warmest clothes and gathering some supplies, she left a note for Sarah Wilson explaining her absence, then headed for the livery stable. The owner, Pete Davis, the sheriff's brother, was reluctant to rent her a horse so late, especially with snow threatening. It's an emergency, Mr. Davis, Faith insisted. I need to reach Mr. Hayes' property tonight. That's 5 miles in the dark, Miss O'Malley, with more snow coming. Pete shook his head. It ain't safe for a woman alone. Then I'll walk if I must. Something in Faith's expression must have convinced him of her determination. Pete sighed. Give me a minute to saddle my steadiest mare, but if anything happens to you out there, I'll never forgive myself. The ride was treacherous. Snow fell in thick, blinding flakes, and the temperature dropped steadily. Faith relied on the mare's instincts and the occasional glimpse of the moon when clouds briefly parted. By the time she reached Preston's land, her fingers were numb despite her gloves, and exhaustion pulled at her like a physical weight. A lantern burned in the temporary shelter Preston had erected for himself and the construction workers. Faith dismounted stiffly and tied the mare to a post before approaching the door. Preston's expression when he opened it to her knock shifted from surprise to alarm in an instant. Faith, what in God's name are you doing out in this storm? He pulled her inside, helping her remove her snow-covered cloak and gloves. You're half frozen. Jenkins, Faith managed through chattering teeth. He's planning something against you. Lori overheard him and Henderson. Preston's face hardened as he guided Faith to a chair near the pot-bellied stove. Tell me everything. As warmth gradually returned to her limbs, Faith recounted Lori's visit and the conversation she'd overheard. Preston listened intently, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. I was right about the fire, he said when she finished. Jenkins must have recognized me after all. What are we going to do? Faith asked. If he's desperate enough to consider violence. Preston knelt before her, taking her hands in his. We have enough evidence now. I'll ride for Denver tomorrow, bring back a federal marshal. Jenkins has committed fraud across state lines that puts him under federal jurisdiction. Let me come with you. No. Preston's tone was firm. You'll be safer in town with people around you. I need to know you're protected while I'm gone. Faith wanted to argue but recognized the logic in his words. Promise me you'll be careful. If Jenkins suspects you're going for the authorities, I'll leave at first light before anyone's likely to notice. Preston touched her cheek gently. Faith, why did you risk coming out in this storm? You could have been lost or frozen. Because I couldn't bear the thought of something happening to you. Faith's voice wavered. Because I love you, Preston Hayes, and I only just realized it. I wasn't going to lose you before I had the chance to tell you. Preston's eyes widened, then softened with an emotion that made Faith's heart race. Say it again, he whispered. I love you. The words came easier this time, like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. I thought I needed more time to be sure, but when Laurie told me you were in danger, I knew. I've known for weeks, really. I was just afraid to admit it. Preston pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of longing and promise and a future neither had dared imagine before. When they finally drew apart, he pressed his forehead to hers. I love you, Faith O'Malley. Have since the moment you stood up to Mabel Henderson in that diner. I just never dreamed you might come to love me too. They spent the night in the shelter, Faith sleeping on Preston's narrow cot while he kept watch by the stove. The storm intensified, making travel impossible until morning. As dawn broke, revealing a world transformed by snow, Preston prepared to leave for Denver. Stay here, he urged Faith. It's safer than trying to return to town in these conditions. Faith shook her head. I need to be at my shop. If I'm suddenly missing the same day you leave, it might alert Jenkins that something's wrong. Reluctantly, Preston agreed to her logic. Promise me you'll stay around others. Don't be alone. I promise. Faith straightened his collar. How long will you be gone? 3 days if the weather holds. The marshal will need time to organize a proper arrest. Faith nodded, fighting back fear. 3 days. I'll count every hour. They parted with a kiss that held both passion and desperation. As Faith rode back toward Silver Creek, she kept glancing over her shoulder, watching Preston's figure grow smaller as he headed in the opposite direction. Back in town, Faith tried to maintain a normal routine. She opened her shop, greeted customers, and worked on orders as if nothing were amiss. But her nerves were stretched taut, her senses alert to every door that opened, every unfamiliar footstep. Late that afternoon, Howard Jenkins himself entered the millinery shop. Faith's hand stilled on the hat she was trimming, but she forced her expression to remain pleasant. Mr. Jenkins. How unexpected. Is Laurie looking for a new hat? Jenkins closed the door behind him, the small bell jingling discordantly. No, Miss O'Malley, I've come to speak with you about Preston Hayes. Faith set down her work carefully. Oh, what about him? I understand you two have become close. Jenkins removed his hat, revealing steel gray hair and cold eyes. I feel it's my duty to warn you about his character. Hayes isn't who he claims to be. And who does he claim to be, Mr. Jenkins? Faith kept her voice neutral, though her heart hammered in her chest. A simple cattle buyer looking to establish himself. In reality, he's a swindler with a grudge against successful businessmen like myself. Jenkins stepped closer to the counter. He's been spreading lies about me in Denver, attempting to damage my reputation. Faith met his gaze steadily. How interesting. And why would he do that? Who knows what motivates such men? Jenkins' smile didn't reach his eyes. Perhaps jealousy. Perhaps simple greed. The point is, Miss O'Malley, associating with Hayes could be dangerous for your reputation and your business. The threat was thinly veiled. Faith felt anger replace her fear. Are you suggesting my shop might suffer another unfortunate accident, Mr. Jenkins? A flicker of surprise crossed his face before he mastered it. I was referring to social consequences, of course. Silver Creek is a small town with traditional values. Indeed it is. A town where arson is still considered a serious crime, I believe. Faith moved from behind the counter, putting herself directly before Jenkins. As is fraud and conspiracy to commit violence. Jenkins' expression hardened. You should be careful about making accusations, Miss O'Malley. It's not an accusation when there's proof. Faith lifted her chin. Preston left for Denver this morning. He's bringing back a federal marshal with evidence of your crimes, both past and present. It was a calculated risk, revealing their plan. But Faith hoped that if Jenkins believed the authorities were already involved, he might flee rather than attempt anything more dangerous. For a moment, Jenkins seemed genuinely stunned. Then his face twisted with rage. You stupid woman. Do you think I don't have friends in Denver? Ways of knowing when someone's working against me? He grabbed Faith's arm. Where is Hayes now? The exact location. Take your hands off me, Faith said coldly, or I'll scream loud enough to bring everyone on Main Street running. Jenkins released her, but his eyes burned with malice. This isn't over, not by a long shot. He jammed his hat back on his head. You and Hayes have made a serious mistake. After he stormed out, Faith sank into a chair, trembling with reaction. She'd miscalculated badly. Instead of frightening Jenkins into flight, she'd merely warned him of Preston's intentions and possibly put Preston in greater danger. Within the hour, Faith had closed her shop and sought out Sheriff Davis. The lawman listened skeptically to her story, but promised to send a telegraph to Denver alerting the authorities there. Not much else I can do, Miss O'Malley, he said with a shrug. Jenkins is an important man in this county. Can't arrest him on the say-so of a girl who might have misunderstood what she heard. Then at least keep an eye on my shop, Faith pleaded, and send someone to check on Lori Jenkins. I'm worried about her safety if her father discovers she spoke to me. That night, Faith stayed with the Wilsons again, unable to face her empty rooms above the shop. Sarah provided comfort and practical advice, while Tommy proudly announced he would stand guard outside Faith's bedroom door with his father's old shotgun. That won't be necessary, Tommy, Faith said with a wan smile. But thank you for the offer. Sleep proved elusive. Faith tossed and turned, plagued by visions of Preston ambushed on the snowy trail to Denver. When dawn finally came, she rose exhausted but determined. Whatever happened, she wouldn't cower in fear. At the shop, Faith was surprised to find Mabel Henderson waiting outside the door. Mrs. Henderson, Faith acknowledged cautiously. I wasn't expecting you. Mabel glanced around nervously. May we speak inside, privately? Intrigued, Faith unlocked the door and ushered the older woman in. Once inside, Mabel seemed to deflate, her usual haughty demeanor replaced by something approaching shame. I've come to warn you, she said without preamble. Jenkins and my husband are planning something terrible. Faith stared at her in shock. Why are you telling me this? Mabel sank into a chair. Because I'm not a monster, Miss O'Malley, despite what you must think of me. I've said cruel things to you, unforgivable things, but I never wanted this. She twisted her hands in her lap. They sent men after Mr. Hayes, and they're planning to burn your shop again tonight with you in it if possible. Why? Faith whispered. Why does Jenkins hate us so much? It's not about you. It's Hayes. My husband finally told me the truth last night after he'd had too much whiskey. Mabel's voice shook. Hayes' father was Jenkins' partner years ago. Jenkins stole from him, drove him to suicide. Now Hayes has proof of it all and of other crimes since. It was confirmation of everything Preston had told her, but hearing it from Mabel made it suddenly, terrifyingly real. "We need to go to the sheriff," Faith insisted. Mabel laughed bitterly. "Davis is in Jenkins' pocket, has been for years." She stood abruptly. "I've said all I came to say. Get out of Silver Creek, Miss O'Malley, today. Now, don't wait for Hayes to return if he even can." After Mabel left, Faith moved on instinct. She packed a small bag with essentials, withdrew her modest savings from the shop's strongbox, and left a note for Sarah explaining that she'd gone to find Preston. Then she headed for the livery stable. Pete Davis was initially reluctant to rent her a horse again. "The trail to Denver's dangerous this time of year, Miss O'Malley, especially for a woman alone." "I don't have a choice, Mr. Davis. Preston's in danger." Something in her expression must have convinced him. Pete sighed, then said quietly, "Take the North Trail instead. It's longer but safer." "And Faith," he pressed a small revolver into her hand. "My brother may be Jenkins' man, but I ain't. Never liked how that bastard runs this town." The journey was brutal. Snow had drifted in places, forcing Faith's horse to pick its way carefully. The cold bit through her heaviest coat, and twice she lost the trail completely, relying on the horse's instincts to find it again. By late afternoon, Faith was fighting exhaustion. She had no idea if she was on the right path, if Preston had taken this route, or if she was merely riding deeper into wilderness. Just as despair began to overtake her, she spotted smoke rising above the trees ahead. Heart pounding, Faith urged her tired mount forward. The trail opened onto a small clearing where a cabin stood, smoke curling from its chimney. Faith approached cautiously, Pete's revolver clutched in her numb fingers. Before she could call out, the cabin door opened, and a familiar figure emerged with an armload of firewood. "Preston!" Faith cried, her voice breaking with relief. Preston dropped the wood, his face registering shock, then joy, then alarm as he ran to her. "Faith, what are you doing here? What's happened?" As he helped her dismount, Faith's legs buckled from cold and exhaustion. Preston caught her, lifting her easily into his arms and carrying her into the cabin's warmth. Inside, Faith found not only Preston but an older man with a weathered face and a silver star pinned to his vest. "Faith, this is Marshal Bennett," Preston said as he settled her near the fire. "He was already on Jenkins' trail when I reached Denver." "Pleasure, madam," the marshal nodded. "Though I'm guessing your presence here means trouble back in Silver Creek." Between sips of hot coffee, Faith explained everything: Mabel's warning, the men sent after Preston, the plan to burn her shop again. As she spoke, Preston's expression grew increasingly grim. "We need to go back," he said when she'd finished. "Tonight." Marshal Bennett shook his head. "Not in this weather, not in the dark. We'll leave at first light." "That may be too late," Faith protested. "If they're planning to burn the shop tonight, your shop is empty, Faith," Preston reminded her gently. "And you're safe here. Jenkins' men won't find us. This cabin belongs to a friend of the marshal's. It's not on any map." Faith wanted to argue further, but exhaustion overwhelmed her. The last thing she remembered was Preston wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, his lips pressing a kiss to her forehead as she drifted into sleep. They set out before dawn, Faith riding double with Preston while the marshal led the way. The storm had passed, leaving a crystal-clear sky and bitter cold in its wake. By mid-morning they crested the final ridge overlooking Silver Creek. Smoke rose from multiple buildings on Main Street. "No," Faith whispered, her arms tightening around Preston's waist. "We're too late." They rode hard into town, finding chaos. Bucket brigades fought flames at the bank, the general store, and as Faith had feared, her shop. But the fire hadn't spread as Jenkins had likely intended. Overnight snow had dampened roofs and slowed the flames' progress. As they dismounted near the sheriff's office, Sarah Wilson spotted them and rushed over. "Faith, thank God you're safe." "What happened?" Faith asked, embracing her friend. Jenkins tried to burn half the town any business that might have records of dealings with him. Sarah's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. But Mabel Henderson warned folks last night. Most had time to get out important papers and valuables. "Where's Jenkins now?" Marshal Bennett demanded. "Holed up in his ranch with Henderson and a few loyal hands. They tried to flee when the fires didn't spread as planned, but Pete Davis organized some men to block the road." Sarah nodded toward the livery owner, who stood with a group of determined-looking townsmen. Turns out lots of folks had reasons to dislike Jenkins. They were just waiting for someone brave enough to stand against him. Preston squeezed Faith's hand. "That sounds like someone I know." Marshal Bennett organized a posse, including Sheriff Davis, who seemed eager to demonstrate he wasn't completely in Jenkins' pocket after all. Preston insisted on joining them, despite Faith's fears. "I have to see this through," he told her quietly. "For my father. For all the others Jenkins has hurt over the years." Faith nodded, understanding though it terrified her. "Come back to me. Always." Preston kissed her, not caring who saw. "I have too much to live for now." The standoff at the Jenkins ranch lasted less than an hour. Faced with a federal marshal and 24 armed townsmen, Jenkins' supporters quickly surrendered. Jenkins himself tried to flee out the back, only to be caught by Pete Davis and his brother the sheriff. By sunset, Jenkins, Henderson, and 3 others were locked in the Silver Creek jail, awaiting transfer to Denver for trial. The fires had been extinguished, with Faith's shop suffering the least damage thanks to the warning and preparation. As Faith and Preston stood surveying the smoke-damaged interior of her shop, he slipped an arm around her waist. "It can be rebuilt, better than before." Faith leaned against him, suddenly bone-weary but oddly at peace. "Yes, it can. Everything can." Preston turned her to face him. "Faith O'Malley, I had a whole speech planned. Was going to wait until my house was built, do things properly." He smiled ruefully. "But after the past few days, I've realized life's too uncertain for waiting." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside nestled a ring with a single perfect pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "I love you," Preston said simply. "I want to build a life with you, not just a ranch and a millinery shop, but a home, a family, a future." He took her hand. "Will you marry me?" Faith looked into the gray eyes that had captivated her from their first meeting in Clara's diner. In them, she saw everything she'd never dared hope for: respect, partnership, and a love that didn't demand she become less in order to be cherished more. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, I will marry you, Preston Hayes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Faith heard a commotion outside. They stepped onto the boardwalk to find what seemed like half the town gathered, led by Sarah Wilson and her children. "We thought you might say yes," Sarah explained with a grin, "so we brought a little celebration." Someone had salvaged a fiddle from the chaos, and its joyful tune filled the air as townspeople pressed forward to offer congratulations. Even Mabel Henderson appeared, subdued but determined to make amends. "I was wrong about you," she told Faith quietly. "Wrong about a lot of things." Faith squeezed the older woman's hand. "It's never too late to start again." As twilight deepened into night, Faith and Preston stood surrounded by their newfound community people who had finally seen beyond convention to recognize the strength it took to forge one's own path. "Dance with me," Preston murmured in Faith's ear. And there on Main Street, with stars appearing overhead and the scent of smoke still lingering in the air, Faith danced in the arms of the man who had seen her not as a spinster, but as a woman who had waited just long enough to find exactly what she needed. "You know," Preston said as he twirled her beneath the stars, "I thought I came to Silver Creek to settle an old score. Turns out I came to start a new life instead." Faith smiled up at him. "And I thought I came to prove I didn't need anyone. Turns out independence means choosing who to let into your life, not keeping everyone out." Preston pulled her closer. "Do you regret waiting all these years, missing out on what other women your age already have?" Faith shook her head. "No, you came right on time for me, Preston Hayes. Not a moment too soon, not a moment too late, right when I was ready to meet you. And you for me," he whispered against her hair. "Right on time." 6 months later, on a perfect June morning, Faith O'Malley became Faith Hayes in a ceremony beside the creek on Preston's land. Their home stood nearby, a sturdy 2-story structure with wide windows and a wrap-around porch. Behind it, the framework of stables rose against the mountain backdrop, promising the fulfillment of Preston's dream. Faith's shop in town had been rebuilt and expanded, with a workroom large enough for her to take on 2 apprentices, including Emma Wilson, who showed remarkable talent for the craft. 3 days a week, Faith created her designs there. The rest of her time she spent at the ranch, establishing a garden and helping Preston with the horses. As the newly married couple greeted their guests at the wedding celebration, Mabel Henderson approached with a small package. "A gift," she said, handing it to Faith. "Something to remember that good can come from the worst circumstances." Inside was a framed sampler, clearly stitched by Mabel herself. It read, "She was shamed for not marrying young. The cowboy said you came right on time for me." Faith felt tears spring to her eyes as she embraced the older woman. "Thank you, Mabel. It's perfect." That night, as Faith and Preston stood on the porch of their new home, watching moonlight silver the landscape that was now theirs, she reflected on the journey that had brought them together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come to Silver Creek seeking justice?" she asked, leaning against his solid warmth. Preston's arms tightened around her. "I think some things are meant to be, no matter what path leads to them. I would have found you somehow, Faith Hayes." "Or I would have found you," she countered with a smile. Either way, Preston turned her to face him, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "We found each other at exactly the right time, and I plan to spend the rest of my life being grateful for that." As he lowered his lips to hers, Faith knew with absolute certainty that every choice, every struggle, every moment of standing strong against convention had led her precisely where she was meant to be, in the arms of a man who valued her independence as much as he cherished her love, in a life that was everything she had once feared to dream possible. The path to happiness, Faith realized, was never about following others' timelines or expectations. It was about having the courage to wait for what was truly right and the wisdom to recognize it when it finally appeared. For Faith and Preston, it had come right on time.